Greetings, I am Ita. Now, you may look at me and assume that I'm goth, and you'd be correct in that assumption, but you may also look at someone like this and assume that she's dressed gothic as well. So, what counts as goth fashion? The start of goth fashion began in the 1980s. Following the spiky rage of the post-punk music scene before it, came a softer, more sorrowful, and introspective sound, which came to be known as goth music. I went into more detail about the history of goth music in my previous video, but it was these music scene origins that truly defined the fashion. Musicians such as Susie Sue incorporated several different unique themes into their styles, such as androgyny, vintage clothes, fetish wear, and Victorian-era fashion. These goth fashion origins drew from punk ideals of self-expression and non-conforming, and used that to create a more dark and haunting style. With the rise of goth music came goth clubs and other music scenes that allowed for gothic people to express themselves freely, which gave way to the expansion of goth fashion. Some religious iconography, such as crosses and ankhs, were incorporated into the style, as well as dark makeup and wild hair. There was so much room for creative freedom within this style, but it was all tied together by goth's love for the mysterious and macabre, to create stunning yet spooky outfits that made you stand out from normal society. But when the 80s moved on into the 90s, many of these goth bands moved on as well, either changing their musical style or disbanding entirely. And while many goths still stayed within the community and wore the fashion, a new type of goth would soon emerge: mall goths. Hot Topic opened in 1987 and quickly became, well, a hot topic. Mall goths were a new genre of so-called goths that hung out at the mall wearing all the newest, trendiest alternative clothing. While mall goth is its own distinct style, often including trip pants, fishnet tops, band tees, and bolder colors, mall goth is also often used as an umbrella term for many of the alternative styles that came about to the late 90s to early 2000s. This included emos and scene queens, as well as several other sub-goth styles that I'll get into a bit later. Mall goths were widely disliked by the goths that came before them, as these people were seen as just goth for the fashion. But nevertheless, mall goths saw their way into the early and late 2000s, leaving the goth music of the 80s and 90s behind them. The early 2000s is really where the lines became blurred on what was and wasn't goth, especially for those not in these alternative spheres. Not only was there a boom in alternative fashion styles, there was also an increase of goth-coded characters in the media. But let's rewind a bit, as some of the earlier goth characters in the media did actually have a part to play in the fashion. The earlier fictional goth icons that we know and love are based off of the gothic literatures that came before them, such as Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and my personal favorite, Phantom of the Opera. These early literatures cemented many of the defining gothic aesthetics, with themes of horror, haunting and spooky settings, monsters and villains, as well as Victorian fashion and architecture. This led to characters such as Vampira in the 1950s, Morticia Addam in the 1980s, and later Lydia Deetz in the 1980s. While these earlier goth icons in the media inspired goths in their fashion and aesthetics, supposed goth icons of the 2000s to 2010s were actually stereotyping goths. This led to the idea of what goth fashion has to become even more skewed, with the most common depiction of a goth just being an angsty teenage girl who wears all black and is just going through a phase. This era of media was just society's depictions of anyone that didn't conform, and created a new image of goths as just a depressed teen that wore dark clothes, and the stereotype would remain for years to come. Just to add to this chaos of nobody knowing what real goths look like, several goth-adjacent styles were popping up around this time as well. For example, cybergoth was a huge goth substyle at the time, taking on the Victorian and fetish wear aspects from goth, but incorporating neon colors, sci-fi or steampunk elements, and rave wear. Another prominent style was new goth or casual goth, which is a more comfy and hipster-esque way of dressing goth, often leaning towards a more witchy aesthetic, with crescent moons, wide-brimmed hats, and "Witch Please" decals. Another comfy goth style came about at this time as well, with the rise of pastel goth. Pastel goth took all the spooky imagery of goth, such as bats, crosses, moons, skulls, and ghosts, and softened it with the cute pastel colors and oversized comfy sweaters. While these styles are not goth in the sense that they aren't tied to the music, they are clearly heavily inspired by many gothic elements and outfits from the original fashion, and so I don't think they are trying to redefine what is goth, but rather are using goth as a descriptor for their faction being inspired by goths. Regardless, with all these styles being called something goth, this certainly created even more confusion for what could or should be goth fashion. Now, it gets worse before it gets better. Just as all of this oversaturation and misinformation was about to boil over, 2019 hit and well, the pot certainly boiled over. The explosion of trendy internet alternative fashion put the final nail in the coffin of people just completely forgetting any original definitions of goth, and specifically goth fashion. So, instead of asking an emo in the early 2000s if they were goth, e-girls and e-boys were just considered goth, no questions asked. Lil Peep was just considered goth, no questions asked. All of this confusion, misconceptions, and stereotyping from the decade prior led to anyone with a slightly darker or alternative outfit on to be called goth. This even made its way outside of social media and into the news, with news articles calling celebrities goth just because they wore a black dress on the red carpet. One article was even claiming that Ivanka Trump had a goth phase because she used to listen to Nirvana. This is a real article that someone wrote. Despite the massive influx of countless alternative styles popping up online, goth fashion did actually come back to life, for the most part. There are still endless debates online about which clothes are considered goth, with many goths finding certain prints like pentagrams and skulls to be tacky, and many genres of goth fashion such as romantic goth or corporate goth not being accepted by some people, despite these styles incorporating many of the defining features of the fashion from the 80s and 90s. Romantic goth specifically derives from the dark romance novels of early Gothic literature, dressing as the damsels in distress from those stories might have, with a huge emphasis on Victorian-era inspired clothing, creating a visual style that would be fit for any vampire princess. And corporate goth is a wonderful addition to Gothic fashion. It allows for those of us who would normally be outcasts from the professional workforce for the way we dress to still express ourselves in our dark style, while also having an equal opportunity to progress in our jobs and careers. Especially now with the influx of baby bats and elder goths alike on the internet, there is so much more accessibility and resources for anyone looking to get into the subculture, as well as finally having more representation. There are plenty of complaints of goth going mainstream, but this mainstream attention has helped to show just how much diversity there really is within this subculture. The definition of goth fashion has gone through so many changes over time, and whether or not you agree with the different styles of goth, I think these outfits are still goth. They are faithful to the origins of goth fashion, incorporating all the same elements and aesthetics, but experimenting and expanding upon them as well. Goth fashion back in the day was a product of its time, and goth fashion today is equally a product of its time. And thanks to the internet, we have so many more gothic references to pull from, like fashion, decor, movies and shows, and even newer goth music as well. There are so many more things that can draw you into this dark and mysterious lifestyle, and so many more things to appreciate within the subculture as a whole. Thank you all for watching. Please let me know in the comments how you feel about modern day goth fashion. Also, if you would be so kind as to support my business on Instagram, or if you would like to see these strange and unusual things I do on TikTok, the links will be in the description below. Until next time, farewell.